Alrighty, I'm going to get us started. Folks may still be trickling in, but I want to give as much time and space to our wonderful co-hosts this morning to have a really great discussion. So thank you so much for joining us for this second session in our intersectional webinar series. We are super excited to kick off this series here at the partnership. We've prepared a wide range of conversations for you all with advocates and leaders in other sectors to talk about the impact that a lack of safe, affordable housing has on their work and our work collectively. My name is Danielle Hubely. I manage advocacy and education with the Partnership for Strong Communities. And before I get into a little bit more information about the partnership, and today's topic in general, I just want to remind you that this series is going to be taking place on the first Wednesday of every month. Started in February and is running through October. If you are feeling sad already that there's not going to be a session in November, don't be, because that is when we host our Affordable Housing Conference. So there's going to be like a whole bunch more learning to be had there as well. So please plan to join us for that. And some really quick housekeeping before I dive into the conversation we're having today. The session is being recorded. We are going to publish it to our YouTube channel sometime within the next week. So if you or folks you know really want to tune into this conversation and weren't able to join us this morning, you can find us there. If you have any questions, you can use the chat box feature at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. You can drop in any questions. Feel free to drop them throughout the conversation or save them for the end, but we'll make space to get to as many as we can in the hour that we have this morning. And we'll make sure that you have access to contact information. So if you still have questions after today's conversation, you can reach any of us to stay a part of the conversation moving forward. So with that, let's dive in. Let me first introduce you to the partnership and why we're hosting this series. So the partnership promotes equitable change in Connecticut housing policy by coordinating advocacy. We advance research and we work to unite diverse partners. Our vision is that everyone in Connecticut has a safe, stable home that is affordable to them in an equitable community of their choice. And our mission is carried out through partnerships. We are committed to policies and practices that reduce disparities in housing and within our organization. We ground our works in fact and data, and we prioritize housing solutions that will be affordable and sustainable in the long term. We work to actively create and support an anti-racist, inclusive culture throughout all of our work, internally and externally. We're committed to addressing policies and practices that perpetuate disparities in housing and within our organization. And we believe that housing is a human right. We ground our work in honest, factual, data-driven information that we use to dispel myths, challenge stereotypes, and fill gaps in knowledge to drive narrative, policy, and systems change. And we prioritize housing solutions that will be affordable and sustainable in the long term. We focus on the full spectrum of housing needs and experiences from communities now and for generations to come. So how do we actualize or realize our vision? We know that a healthy housing system necessitates a comprehensive approach that intertwines housing affordability, creation, choice, and stability. People need to afford their homes while meeting their other basic needs. We need more physical homes, period. And we need all different types of homes for people to choose from in all communities across our state. And people should have the right to safe, stable homes and should be supported from the experiences of housing instability, eviction, and homelessness. So this is really how we weave a housing system that prioritizes the needs of our residents and that supports strong families and stronger communities. And specifically to orient ourselves to today's conversation is really going to be honing in, I believe, around this housing stability sort of priority bucket. So think about these sort of buckets where they fit into your work, think about where it applies to the conversations we're having, but again, just to sort of set the stage, we're talking about this stability bucket really today. So what you see here is a word cloud that was generated at our 2023 Affordable Housing Conference this past November, where we asked attendees to share the words or phrases that describe what a thriving community looks like to them. And what you see here is a culmination of about 81 different responses. And I share this really to show that what we see here is that a thriving community is inherently intersectional. And so when we think about the phrase intersectionality, what am I actually talking about, right? We define intersectionality as it's a framework for conceptualizing a person, a group of people, or social problem as affected by a number of different influences. It takes into account people's overlapping identities and experiences in order to understand the complexity of what they're facing or what their life experience may be. When we think about building thriving communities, we need to think beyond just the lack of available housing options. We need to think about the accessibility of food, clean water, healthcare, greener third spaces are sometimes referred to, school systems, services, diversity, all of these things and more. Nothing exists in a vacuum, especially not housing. And that's really why we're hosting this series. Really quickly, as we think about the intersectionality of the conversation around housing and all of its many facets, I think it's also really important that we take a moment to acknowledge its inextricable link to the land that we are building and living on. While there's a lot of work for us still to do that goes beyond just acknowledging the history, a great place to start is by learning a little bit more about the land that you do live on. I'll have Alicia share in the chat a link to it's called nativeland.ca. They have a great wealth of resources and continue to expand on that to identify a little bit more about the history of the land that you're living on and the tribal communities that still exist in your area of the state. There's also a link that we'll share to a report that was done covering some of Connecticut's history of Native American land, just as a starting place to begin that journey of learning. It is my pleasure to introduce you to Rashida Rattray and Dahlia Romanow with the Connecticut Fair Housing Center. They are going to guide us on a really great conversation around the intersection of fair, safe, accessible, and affordable housing. And with that, I'm really excited to pass it off to Rashida to get us started.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the warm welcome. And just the information that was presented before is just really amazing and really thought provoking. And hopefully that we could add to that conversation and those, those thoughts that are starting to build and generate. So let me share my screen. Just to talk a little bit about the work of the Connecticut Fair Housing Center and kind of how this fits in with the overarching theme of housing affordability. So again, good morning. My name is Rashida Rattray Reed. I'm joined by my colleague, Dahlia Romanow, and we're going to talk a little bit about what fair housing is. So essentially, fair housing is the right to choose housing that is free from unlawful discrimination. We have federal and state protections that are put in place to make sure that people are not facing discrimination, and if they are, there is a way for them to report that discrimination when it happens. This covers transactions such as rentals, sales, lending, accessing shelter, and insurance. The Fair Housing Act was born from decades of discrimination, segregation, and disinvestment, and it's made manifest through the Fair Housing Act of 1968, which was signed in April of 1968, making April Fair Housing Month. So keep your eyes posted on our website and our socials because we'll be, having some events and, very active during the month of April. But getting back to the crux of the Fair Housing Act, it prohibits discrimination in housing transactions, housing-related services based on your membership in a protected class. And we're also going to go over what protected classes are in a couple of slides. But just know that once you're a member of these protected classes, you are able to be protected under the Fair Housing Act. And it also protects against retaliation against individuals who have filed fair housing complaints or who are participating in fair housing investigations. So a little bit about us at the Connecticut Fair Housing Center. Our mission is really in line with the mission of the partnership, but we're here to ensure that everyone across the state has equal access to housing opportunities that are ideally free from discrimination. And much like the partnership does, we focus on these complexities of interlocking oppressions and how they correlate with housing discrimination. We recognize that there's intersectionality, right? And we all have different identities and different roles that we play. And we always like to examine how those roles combine, right? And how those roles kind of lead up to housing discrimination or look against the lens of housing discrimination. We also assist Connecticut homeowners and residents who are at risk of facing foreclosure. The work we do has expanded as the needs of our residents have expanded. We started off in 1994, and now we're in the 30th year of our work this year. And the work that we have done has, expanded from 1994. And unfortunately, housing discrimination is still happening. So we're still looking to expand the work that we do in a number of ways. But the work that we do is pretty simple. So it fits into these 5 categories. We offer foreclosure prevention and intervention services to Connecticut homeowners who are at risk of or are currently going through the foreclosure process. We do that by offering what we call virtual advice panels, where legal staff is able to consult with individuals who are going through that process. The education and outreach piece of our work, I would like to say is key, just a little biased, but I always feel like education is really the cornerstone of this journey, because by fostering awareness of fair housing laws and rights, we're able to empower individuals across the state to be able to have that knowledge to navigate the complexities of this housing landscape that we're in. So my job is simple. I am on a mad dash across the state trying to ensure that anyone who has any proximity to housing knows that the Fair Housing Act exists, knows that there are protections under that, and knows that we exist as an agency to enforce the Fair Housing Act. Our policy advocacy piece of work is really in full swing right now. And one of the main things that we do in our policy advocacy is advocate and fight for policy that has a more equitable impact on the housing landscape that we have in our state. And Dahlia is going to get into and speak a little bit more about one of our policy priorities this legislative session. And that also mixes in with our tenant organizing and movement lawyering piece of our work, where we recognize that tenants across the state are often feeling disempowered in their situations, but they do have the right to unionize and organize. And a big component of the work that we do is making sure that these individuals know that they have that right and pointing them in the direction of resources that they need to accomplish organizing. Lastly, we are a fair housing investigation and enforcement agency, meaning that we do have the right to investigate claims of discrimination. And if discrimination is found, we do have the right to enforce the Fair Housing Act. Now, that is on a case-by-case basis. There's no one-size-fits-all way to enforce the Fair Housing Act, but it can look as simple as writing a cease or desist letter, or it can be as complex as representing an individual who has been discriminated against in a case. So just know that we are proponents of enforcing the Fair Housing Act, and if you feel that you have been discriminated against, we are one of the agencies that you can come and report that to. And we're going to get into the details of what that discrimination looks like in a couple of slides. But just to define and just to give space for our protected classes, we have our federal protected classes, which is countrywide, all of our states. It is a violation of the Fair Housing Act to discriminate against anyone in any housing transaction based on their race, color, national origin, sex, disability, religion, or familial status, which is the presence of children within a family. The federal protections under sex have recently been expanded to include gender identity and expression and sexual orientation, but Connecticut has taken a step to really add some protected classes, making us and making our state one of the strongest fair housing protected classes in the country, right? So we have ancestry, marital status, age, sexual orientation, lawful source of income, so whether an individual is using a subsidy to pay their rent or their mortgage, SSI, SSDI, Section 8 are common examples. Gender identity and expression, veteran status, and most recently, survivors of domestic violence have been added to our state-specific protected class list. Now, if you go to different states around the country, their state-specific protected classes will look a lot different. There may be less. There may be some things on our list that you don't see. But Connecticut has really been doing the work as far as advocating for individuals who need to be added to this protected class list. And we've been trying to cover everyone under this fair housing umbrella. So when we talk about discrimination, I probably said that word maybe 50 times within the past, 6 minutes, but let's take a step back and define what we're talking about. So under the Fair Housing Act, discrimination takes two forms. It's either differential treatment, which is treating people differently because of their membership in a protected class, which is usually direct, right? It usually sounds like, I'm not going to rent to you because you have a disability and you're using a mobility device. I'm not going to allow you to have a service or support animal, or I'm not selling you a house in this area because of your race. I usually define differential treatment as something that is easy to identify. It feels like a gut feeling almost. Disparate impact is a little bit more complicated. It is a neutral rule that has a greater negative effect on members of a protected class. So going back to our protected class list, I always get the comment that individuals who are justice impacted or may have criminal records are not explicitly represented on our protected class list, whether it's federal or state. And that is true. But let's say a housing provider had a blanket rule or policy that said no one with an arrest or no one with a conviction will be accepted, or applications will be accepted, or will be able to rent from this property. That would violate the Fair Housing Act through the rule of disparate impact, because it would have a greater negative effect on our race and color protected classes, seeing at the high rate that individuals of color are arrested and convicted federally and in the state of Connecticut. By putting a rule like that in place, it would have a greater negative effect on our federal protected classes. So through the rule of disparate impact, we're able to kind of pull individuals who are not explicitly stated on our protected class list under this fair housing umbrella for protection. So I'm just going to quickly go through this slide. I'm not going to go into too much detail because I really do want to spend the crux of our time together today kind of having discussion. But just giving you a little framework on how housing discrimination tends to show up in a housing search. There may be misrepresentation of the availability of housing. Sometimes when housing providers find out something about a potential tenant that sparks their biases, they will sometimes misrepresent the availability of housing. That sometimes sounds like you're talking to a housing provider about maybe viewing a unit or putting in an application. Everything sounds good until you mention that you have a child or you have children. And all of a sudden, the housing provider says something maybe to the effect of they're working with someone else to secure this rental. They're going to check with them. They may have already accepted a deposit. Phrases like that to kind of deter the individual from being able to pursue that rental unit. We've seen flat out refusal to rent or sell. We've seen unequal terms and conditions where individuals of protected classes, for example, an individual with a disability is charged insurance or is told that they have to get insurance for their service or support animal, but this is not happening to any other tenant that is living at the residence. We've seen uses of threats, intimidation, or coercion. People have put up discriminatory advertisements. We've seen things such as able-bodied preferred, better for single professional in ads that have been posted for rental units. And lastly, discrimination with a smile, where it seems as if the individual is trying to do you well, but it can be seen as steering. So for example, maybe someone with a mobility device is looking at a unit and the housing provider assumes that this individual is going to need medical care around the clock and there's no hospital within the proximity of the unit, right? And kind of trying to refer them to another unit or another side of town that may be closer to medical services. It seems as if this person is goodwill and they're trying to help out, but really it is discrimination with a smile. The point and purpose of the slide is everyone should be able to have access to living wherever they can afford to live, free from unlawful discrimination. So a little bit about, where we are coming from fair housing wise. All of the things that we're seeing in housing today are not accidents, right? These are not things that have just popped up randomly. We have had decades of discriminatory policies that has shaped our built environment, and it continues to contribute to the lack of wealth accumulation for families of color and the extreme racial and economic segregation of our neighborhoods. And I have a 2-hour-long presentation that I can do on, 100 years of fair housing history and kind of policies that have brought us to this place. But for the sake of brevity and time, I'm going to try to condense that 2-hour-long presentation into maybe like 3 minutes. So logically, when you have an influx of people, you're going to need housing for them. But where you put that housing and who gets to access and live there is truly what shapes our communities. So in our presentation, we talk about worker housing that was built before and during the Industrial Revolution, and how that housing often excluded non-white workers, pushing them to the fringes of town and leaving them out of resource-rich areas that were created around factory-built housing. Pictured here is the Colt factory housing built in 1910. So there we've already started this pattern of segregation and exclusion. Moving into the 1920s and 1930s with the looming threat of the Great Depression, in order to protect that real estate, the FHA, or the Federal Housing Administration, created the HOLC, or the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which assessed the risk of lending, right, and created redlining to do that. Non-white neighborhoods were often redlined, and you could see that redlining map right above that verbiage there, where you could see the green and blue areas of that map were often seen as desirable places to live, desirable places for real estate investment, and also desirable places for for foreclosure remediation funds if the Great Depression tanked that real estate that was being developed. No surprise here that that was predominantly where our white and affluent families were living, whereas the yellow and red areas of that map were seen as hazardous and not fit for real estate investment, not fit for mortgage lending either. And our families of color, our Black and brown families, were mostly hyper-focused in those yellow and red areas of that map. Then we move on to post-World War II development, where all of this money is pouring into the federal government, and they're using that to build suburbs, right, and build single-family homes for servicemen and for people who were in the Army who were coming back after fighting the war. Unfortunately, families of color were often excluded from home ownership and kind of kept in these urban and overpopulated places in our towns. And by excluding these families from home ownership, we also created a wealth gap between white families and families of color that we have not yet closed since the 60s. And moving on, while that was happening, highway development and urban renewal came as a way to decimate non-white urban neighborhoods. So I put this slide in here just to highlight that these were choices that were made, right? This is not, none of the things that we're seeing today in housing are accidental. There were choices and policies that were put into place that kind of led us to the, again, housing landscape that we see today. And I know I gave Connecticut a huge pat on the back earlier because those protected classes are so amazing. Like, if you look in any other state, they're not as extensive as they are in our state. But despite that, we're still a very highly segregated state, with 67% of our population of color living in 8% of Connecticut's towns. And in Connecticut specifically, people with disabilities and people who have housing vouchers experience discrimination at higher rates than every other protected class. And I could tell you that number, and 67% living in 8% of Connecticut's towns, and it can look very daunting, but it isn't until you see this figure on a map. This map was pulled in March of 2023, where the teal is representative of the percent of non-white residents by census tract. So you can see that, our percent of non-white residents by census tract are hyper-focused in our cities, right? Your Hartfords, your Waterburys, your Stamfords, your Bridgeports, and New Havens, right? We are doing a really good job at enacting fair housing protections. But what we really need is realization that the Fair Housing Act truly exists across our state, and more enforcement, right? So that we're able to diversify this map so that our percent of non-white residents are not just hyper-focused in our cities across the state. That being said, I'm going to take a step back and pass it over to my colleague Dahlia, who will tie in what we're doing for tenant organizing into this conversation. So take it away, Dahlia.
Thank you so much, Rashida. So I'm going to sort of pivot to talking about the work that the center has been doing and other organizations in Connecticut have been doing about organizing for tenant power. So the way that we see this is that, and to tie it kind of into what Rashida was talking about, many of the protected classes under the Fair Housing Act are also groups of people who are disproportionately renters and not homeowners. And so a lot of the work that the center does is looking at how we can give power back to tenants, how we can both give tenants access to homeownership, but also give them access to dignity and stability while they are tenants. And we have seen in the past 4 years or so, basically since 2020 with COVID, an explosion in tenant organizing in response to the crisis that was just exacerbated by COVID, with rising rents, poor conditions, an increase in out-of-state landlords. And the reason that organizing is such a powerful tool is because it takes individual tenants who have very little power in negotiating or anything compared to their landlord and joins them together. So there are more tenants than there are landlords, and when they all work together, that power balance can shift. And I believe that since 2020, there have been about 45 tenant unions established in the state, which is just like huge. Together, these tenant unions have been working to push for change on various levels. So building wide, we've seen organizing around fixing conditions, around stopping rent increases, preventing evictions. I'll give an example of a tenant union in New Haven that is getting their huge landlord, Ocean Management, to sit down at the table and negotiate a lease for every tenant in the building. Municipality level, pushing for changes to policies, pushing for establishment of fair rent commissions. And then statewide, there was the Right to Counsel campaign. So in 2021, Connecticut passed a law stating that all tenants facing eviction would have a right to an attorney. And that was as a result of tenant organizing. Last year, there was a push for rent caps, which unfortunately didn't pass. But this year, what I will be talking about is a push for just cause, which I will talk about on the next slide. Okay, so just cause. Right now in Connecticut, there is a law, and it has been on the books for decades, that tenants who are disabled or over the age of 62 and live in an apartment building or a complex with 5 or more units are protected against no cause eviction, which basically means that if a tenant doesn't have a lease or their lease expires and they go month to month, they still cannot be asked to move out without a cause, such as being behind on rent or violating their lease. Right now, there is a bill to expand this protection to all tenants. I believe, so in the slide I said with the exception of owner-occupied 1 to 4 family buildings. Unfortunately, I believe the current language is just to expand the existing just cause to anyone, but still keep in the 5 or more units restriction. But we are still pushing the legislature to even expand that further. This was just voted out of the Housing Committee, which is huge, but we need a huge push to get our legislators to actually call it to the floor and get it passed into law. And so that's my next slide is please contact your legislators. We need everyone, especially people in suburbs, in more rural areas, to be showing that they support just cause and that they need their legislators to actually push to get it through. And I will actually also drop the link to that just cause script, and it like shows you exactly what to say. There's an email that you can work off of. And I'll also just plug, if you want updates on the Just Cause campaign, there's another link to a petition that you can sign that puts you on their email list. And if you or someone you know is interested in getting involved with organizing, please check out the Connecticut Tenant Union's website, and you can check out the resources they have and get connected to them that way.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dahlia. So just kind of to tie in all that has been said, and how does this tie in with affordable housing, right? Because we haven't mentioned affordable housing in our presentation. One of the main proponents of just housing in general, right? Of course, Danielle mentioned earlier that we need to build more housing units. We are at a lack of affordable housing units. But what's important about the Connecticut Fair Housing Center and the Fair Housing Act in general is it is a way to keep people housed, right? We also want to build housing, but we also want to sustain that housing and keep people housed, right? So it's important not only to build these units, but also to have protections, just like Just Cause or just like the Fair Housing Act, that is able to keep people in their homes, right? And protect people against retaliation if they file a fair housing complaint or if they are a part of a fair housing investigation, or protect them to not be evicted without a just cause. So a big part of this affordable housing puzzle is also considering the fact that we need laws, we need legislation, we need protection to make sure that we're not only putting people in housing, but we're keeping them there. So just a little bit about when to call us, right? If you believe that you or a client has faced housing discrimination, if you would like to set up a fair housing training, if you would like to join legislative advocacy efforts that we're involved in, if you or someone you know is facing foreclosure, or if you would like to learn a little bit more about the investigative arm of our work, please feel free to give us a call or send us an email. And you can do that by accessing our website or by reporting discrimination through our intake lines or our online portal. So I'm going to leave this slide up. But this is basically the end of our presentation, and I'm looking forward to a discussion. And I can't see any questions, unfortunately, because I have my slides up. So I'm going to leave it up for a second longer, and then I will stop sharing my screen so I can see everyone.
Yeah, thank you both. We'll give it a minute or two for folks to drop any questions you have in the chat. So I'll just leave a little bit of space. I will also share the link to a YouTube recording from the partnership. We also worked with Sarah White with the Connecticut Fair Housing Center a couple weeks ago now to talk through, right as the legislative session started, everything that's on the partnership's legislative agenda, which includes the just cause evictions piece that Dahlia and Rashida just referenced as well. Like they said as well, the session moves very quickly, so things are there's always opportunities for things to change or look a little bit different than they did a couple weeks ago when we hosted this recording, but it's a good level setting. So I wanted to make sure to share it, but please jump in with any questions folks may have. And feel free as well, if you want to come off mute, raise your hand. I see folks doing that now. Kara, why don't you jump in?
Great. First of all, I just want to say thank you. This was so helpful and very accessible at the same time, so I really appreciate it. And this might be like a little bit off of your focus. So I live in New Canaan, and there has been a lot of controversy around the statute 830G that's basically, it's kind of that like developer's loophole about affordable housing. And it really has been a very contentious issue in our town for the last couple of years. And I'm wondering if you have any insights that you can share from your perspective about the statute. I think there's a lot of unsaid, like dog whistling. It's a lot of NIMBY. Connecticut is very wealthy. It's very white. And basically a developer is able to circumvent the statute and basically skip P&Z if the municipality lets the moratorium, that 10% of affordable housing lapse, and New Canaan did. It's just a mess. And I just would love anything that you can share, what your thoughts are about the statute, the legislation, if anything can be done. The only advocacy that I've found is like change.org petitions to stop this building from being built. Like there's no advocacy about the affordability piece, about the equity piece. I apologize if I've hijacked your message today, but it's so confusing and baffling, and would just love some guidance about how to be of service in this.
Dahlia, I'm not sure if you want to jump in on that.
Honestly, this is not something I've specifically worked on, but I bet if you could like direct message me your email, I could connect you with someone in our office who does. I think anything I said would not be actually that helpful.
Okay, thank you.
Of course.
Thank you. No, I really appreciate it. Yeah, it's just because it's just this like case study that is I find so gross and so inequitable, and it's really hard to find resources how to even start having conversations. And I knew I knew the income inequality in Connecticut, and I knew that housing follows that so closely. And it's what I'm just finding really challenging is that in wealthy communities, it doesn't seem like anybody's interested. And the hypocrisy of the sign on the lawn that says, yes, affordable housing, no, with the developer's name underneath it is really hard to wrap my head around. And so, yes, thank you, Dahlia. I'd love to connect with someone that can just help me parse through. It's
Yeah,
really,
absolutely.
yeah, thank you. Appreciate it. But that was amazing. Thank you for the presentation. That was awesome.
Thank you. And I see something in the chat for you, Cara. So Chelsea just posted something as well. Yeah, I don't have much to add about 830G because I'm not as fully versed. What I could say though, I'm fully versed in advocacy. So if you feel like something is not right, or there are not many people that you see who know about the bill itself or know about the provisions, I always say let the change start with you. So maybe get a couple of people who are like-minded and maybe interested in learning. Maybe you guys learn together and eventually form, an advocacy group.
Thank you. Because it's interesting. So Tom O'Day, he's our Republican state senator. It's like New Canaan, Darien, and I think maybe Stanford. So he's running for your election this November. And one of his cornerstones is to overturn the legislation. Like he doesn't want it at all. Because it's that 10%. So every municipality is required to have 10% of their housing to be quote unquote affordable, which obviously is a sliding scale depending on where you are in Connecticut. And this is actually he's going to take this and run because he's from New Canaan and this was a huge issue. And the developer has actually done this he did it in Greenwich and he knows because a lot of these towns are not paying attention to the moratorium. It lapses, he can swoop around and, and there's lawsuits. So the building is actually on pause because both sides are now suing each other. And there's less housing in New Canaan. So, but thank you all. This has been super helpful. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kara. I want to jump over to make sure we get to some other questions as well, but I do want to note, I know Chelsea dropped in the chat that we'll work to connect with you offline. If you want to email myself as well, we are updating our website and putting up a bunch of resources, also on 830G and other issues. So happy to provide those to you and make sure that you're equipped to engage in some of that advocacy and appreciate the question. I think the next question I see is Diana, if you want to jump in.
Yeah, hi everybody. Thank you for the presentation. I'm really trying to follow more things with housing. I'm a manager of the Intercommunities Common Ground, and I'm seeing more and more people that are unhoused and staying in shelters and really trying to get stable and having a very difficult time doing that and staying at baseline because they are unhoused. I mean, it's just such a basic need. I'm wondering, I know that the legislature is kind of looking at different types of innovations, housing innovations and things like that. And I'm wondering, what are they looking at right now? Because I'm sorry that I got a lot on my plate, so I'm trying to figure out what are they doing right now? Just in general, do they have any innovations that they've shared with you, or is there anything on the table right now that we can advocate for? I'm just wondering.
So I don't know, Rashida, do you want to jump in and start and I can follow?
I'm going to give it to you. You could jump in.
Yeah, no worries. Great question, Diana. There's so many things going on right now. There's a lot of discussion around housing on the table, and there's a lot of different solutions being thrown at the wall right now. In a short session, we'll see what we can advance. Just cause evictions is certainly something we would like to see past this session and continue to see protections and provisions for renters. A big issue area for the partnership in particular, if I'm going to do a small little plug, is we're looking in the short term to increase the rental assistance program funding at the state level. being able to help support renters in maintaining housing and avoiding evictions through having those resources available. I did drop the link to our policy and advocacy page, which is
Sure.
a really broad wealth of resources, but we also
Yeah.
are linking all of our testimony from the hearings that we've testified on so that folks can take a look at how we're responding to the issues, what data we're using, how we're speaking to the different need across the state in a lot of these different conversations. So that's like the long short of it. There's a lot going on. I think we could take
Yeah,
up like 3 hours talking through all
I
the
just
specifics.
learned that, I have seen that site that you gave to me, but, I just learned, I saw it on the news that, that the legislator or somebody's giving $672,000 to a veterans home in for a veterans home to be built in Vernon. And, it'll be like for 21 veterans. Are there more things like that that are going on? I mean, I'm just seeing so many people, and like we can absolutely prevent more people from being homeless, but what do we do with the people that are homeless now? And I think that's the biggest thing that I'm dealing with, and a lot of the social clubs are dealing with right now, trying to, we've got nothing to, like, sorry, go back to the shelter. And, especially in the wintertime, it's really hard for you to do that and say, I'm sorry, there's like nothing for you. There's like a waiting list for 3 years for you, so those things can be very discouraging. And, so I'm just wondering if there's anything going on like that, because I actually had some hope about that veterans, but not everybody's a veteran. So
Yeah.
knew of.
I appreciate you raising that. And, it speaks to how the housing continuum exists, right? From folks who are in this like very vulnerable crisis situation all the way through to folks who are stably, comfortably housed and don't have to think about housing as an immediate concern of theirs. I will direct you to the Connecticut Coalition to End Homelessness. They're doing a lot of really great organizing around the homeless response system. To your point, in particular, trying to secure funds on an annualized basis every year. Thank you, Rashida, for particularly cold weather situations, being able to have shelter in place for more folks during those more extreme weather conditions. And they're also looking to boost up the system at large. Unfortunately, to your point in your experience, we're seeing an increase in homelessness more so than we have in Connecticut in the past. And so it's something that's becoming much more prevalent for a lot of families in Connecticut, a lot of individuals. So I appreciate you raising that. We are supporting a lot of CCH's initiatives as well, and uplifting their voice. I'll find the link really quickly and drop that in the chat for you
Okay.
to see what's on their agenda, but certainly supporting those initiatives, and then also making sure that you're reaching out to your elected officials and letting them know the experiences that you're having. It's good for them to be looped into what the conversation and the experiences of folks on the ground. So
Oh, I've talked to them.
I know you have, Diana.
I'm very much like Kara. My personal elected officials, I'm in Tolland, so it's probably very similar to that in New Canaan. But Vernon is very close to Tolland, so it was kind of like, okay, what can we do here? Can we do to create more of these things? Because, young adults are having a really hard time right now as well. And especially people that already have, like qualify for the fair housing and may have been discriminated against in the past because of their race or color, and mental status, because here we are with people that are living with mental illness, and to try and help them become and stay stable, you need to get them the housing. It's like we're going in circles and not getting anywhere with our efforts, just trying to keep people from being hospitalized. I mean, it's at that point, and I guess I'm a little raw right now because we did just lose a member. So I
So
just,
sorry to hear that.
yeah, and so It's just,
Yeah.
it's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking. And I kind of stood up to a lot of people. I went over on my testimony for Demas and everything else. So, but I'm frustrated being on this front line here and
Yeah.
just wondering what, and I know you guys are too, but I'm wondering how can we pool our resources, because our legislators, even if they come up with something, it's like, even if they came up with something now, it'll be 2 years before we see anything happen.
Mhm.
So, I'm just like, what do we tell people now? And I don't have an answer.
Yeah, I hear you. What I will say is that ultimately there's a lot of different ways you can talk to the state legislature. I know you're already doing that. Continue to do so. The conversation that we had in February as well, I'll harken back to, was around land use conversations and speaking with your municipal elected officials. Particularly when we think about local developments, that's a really great place to be plugged in. They're going to be the arbiters, the decision makers on what gets built in your community or not. So having that conversation directly with them as well, putting it on their radar to be responsive to is
So
an
place
opportunity.
that, here's the thing that I'm getting, and that I'm just thinking, because more than one of like mind works. How do we show them that it's a benefit when they don't see the homeless population in their particular community? I think that's a problem that we as advocates are having all throughout the state, because we see the homelessness if we're in Hartford or New Britain or wherever we saw that graphics on that map that you showed us, but they're not seeing it in Tolland. They're not seeing it in New Canaan. So why should they do anything? Because it's not in their backyard. And so that's like, how can we show them that benefit? How can we, and is there a benefit we can create for these communities? This is what's going on in my mind all the time. Like, can we help them do with volunteering or something that they can see that it's a benefit, not a detriment, to have housing communities in, that are affordable for within their municipality. I'm just throwing out ideas. I don't know if that's feasible or not, but certainly it's something to, I've been mulling over in my own brain.
I saw you were looking like you were thinking of something. I don't know if you want to jump in, and then I want to make sure we hand it over to Marisol to jump in as well.
Yes. There has been a lot of conversation about what do we do now, and we have been having circular conversations around that, and it's been very difficult. But one thing that I can say is that for communities that aren't necessarily experiencing this, bring them into it, right? Bring them into the fold. Like, we are a complete state, right? There's stuff happening in Hartford, there's stuff happening in New Haven. And even though these areas on the map that may have less than 15% people of color per their census tract and may not be having these issues, we are still one big state. So just trying to enlighten them and give them the knowledge about what is happening. Because I've also had that experience. And I recently spoke to a colleague about it, where it's just like, you go to these other towns that may be a little bit more on the affluent end, and it's almost as if like, what? People are having problem with housing, and but I think it's really, really important to bring that conversation to them and to show them the other side of the coin, right? Where people are experiencing housing instability. And so it may be a matter of, having people who have the facts and who know and who are on the ground, like you, Diana, go into these places and speak to these individuals. Like, at one point I was doing outreach to like community clubs and book clubs and libraries, and wherever I found people in these towns were actually congregating and meeting, trying to get myself into those spaces as well. And it was hard work. And, it almost feels like in the moment when you're doing it, it feels like you shouldn't be there because it seems as if it's like so far-fetched and people don't really understand it, but you never know who you could inspire, because I've spoken to people and they seemed confused at first, and then I guess they mulled it over and they're like, hey, well, what do I do? How can I contribute to this? And it really is helpful to get those individuals who are in those towns who may not be having the same problems as the Waterburys, the Hartfords, the Stamfords, really get them to start talking to their legislators so that they recognize that this is a statewide problem. This is not just a Connecticut metropolitan area problem.
Well, another problem, I'm just throwing that out, but another problem is that, like, even the town of Tallinn doesn't even have a police department. We use Coventry's police department, so it's like this is an issue, because they're like, well, low income housing is going to bring crime, and we don't even have a police department. So why should you? It's just, and then the biggest thing that they're worried about is lower property taxes. And agreed, we pay a lot of property taxes already, but I just feel like, if that's all they're looking at, they've got blinders on. And I'm trying to, how do we come up with some way to take the blinders off? That's anyway, I don't want to.
I do want to connect with you off air, so we can kind of discuss this in a little bit more detail. So maybe we can try to come up with a plan of a way that you can kind of intersect this, and maybe, we could brainstorm together.
I'd love to
drop I'll drop my contact information in the.
Thank you.
Thank you, Diana.
Yep.
Marisol, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, and Diana actually touched upon something I did want to mention as well and ask about, is, policing. Now, we know that a lot of people that may be able to afford some housing, and what they can afford is probably in the Hartford area, in the Waterbury area, but those places are high in crime. So what are we doing with collaborating with the police, making sure that it's safe so that people that can afford to live in those places are willing to live in those places be safe? Because, an example, I took my son and his wife out of Hartford because they were living in Hartford and there was a shootout. So they shot up into their apartment. It was the only place they couldn't afford. So I had to bring them. I'm in Wethersfield, so I bring them over here. And it's always been my concern. And I love Hartford. I'm, from Hartford, and I would love to invest in Hartford, but will my investment in Hartford to provide, let's say, affordable housing, how would that go? Because of the crime that's in these areas. Not only have, affordable housing in our suburban areas, but how do we protect the ones we have in our metropolitan areas?
Question. I feel guilty because I feel like there's a lot of different ways you can engage in this particular conversation. First and foremost, I'll say we are going to be having a broader dialogue later this summer on the relationship between affordable housing and the criminal justice system and what that experience is like for folks. So we will be diving into that a little bit more. Unfortunately, it'll be later this summer, so not immediately, but as soon as we can get to it. That said, there was some legislation, and I'm trying to find the bill number and our testimony on it. I'll drop it as soon as I'm able to find it for folks, but there was a bill that we testified on that was speaking to so it was, here it is. It's HB 5242 for those of you who are interested in taking a look at the bill itself, but it's an act concerning the collateral consequences of a criminal record on housing opportunities. One of the big challenges that folks face in avoiding needing to re-enter the system, or leaving a system and being able to stabilize and build their life in a healthy way beyond that experience. The biggest challenge a lot of times for folks is that that criminal record, that history that can follow you through records that landlords have access to right now. The goal would be to remove some of those that historical record data after a certain period of time, so that it's not a way that landlords have the ability to place a judgment on you before they've ever met you, right? So there is some legislation. I don't think that that directly addresses the question you posed, but I think it starts to speak to this sort of bigger systemic issue that you're getting at, right? Is that there's a system that exists that isn't being responsive to helping folks rehabilitate and re-enter communities in a healthy and successful way. And so when we think about the challenges with the criminal justice system, that's sort of the lens that we come at it with. I don't know if other folks want to jump in with any additional thoughts.
Yeah, I can jump in. I agree with all that you said too, Danielle. And in addition to that, this is a multi-layered system. So I know that, building housing and having housing in spaces is not, the end all be all. It doesn't solve all the issues. But I know that, housing is a start, and building housing and having housing in these places is a start. And once we recognize these other issues, we can start kind of collaborating to address them. But there's no straight answer that I can give you right now as far as like, okay, well, this is the exact thing that you need to do. But I think it's more just like, being in these spaces and seeing what the needs are, and then, coming together as community to try to address those needs in, a community by community model, because it's not a one size fits all thing. And I do know that there are instances where crime is higher in certain areas, and I think really it's just fixing one piece of the puzzle and then trying to see how we can fix that other piece of the puzzle. And I know that may not be directly helpful right now, but we are definitely working to kind of address all of these systemic issues that kind of combine and make housing what it is. Because of course, like, one of our main proponents is safe, affordable housing, right? So we're always constantly thinking about how to ensure that for our residents across the state.
So I'm just going to really quickly share our contact information on the screen. I know we're getting close to time, and we've had a really great discussion, and there's so many questions included in today's conversation and beyond today's conversation that I think we all want to sit and have together. And that's really the impetus of this series, is to make this space for folks who haven't been engaged in the conversation or who want to engage in this dialogue more with the folks who are doing the work. So I'll just leave everybody's contact information up. Please reach out to us. We all have resources. We're all very passionate about seeing this change happen, and there's a lot of work to be done. So there's certainly room and space and interest in having more conversations offline. So please take advantage of building those relationships and continuing to have this conversation. I shared in the chat the link to our housing data profiles, which give a good summary of each town in the state, what their housing experience is, what some general trends are, experiences, the use of the land, the demographics that exist. It's a good starting place to share with your elected officials, your representatives, your local municipal leaders, pretty much anybody you would like to share it with, to start that conversation and really set the facts straight about what the experience is in your community. As we get closer to the final minute mark of our time here, I did want to just remind you all that there are more conversations to be coming. Our next one is going to take place April 3rd at 10 a.m. I will drop the link shortly in the chat for folks to start registering for that, but we're going to be speaking with Health Equity Solutions and talking about the relationship between affordable housing and health equity. So again, similar sentiments to a lot of the questions that came up today, and the conversations that I know Rashida and Dahlia are having as well. Like I said, housing is so intersectional, and all of these pieces influence one another. So nothing happens in a bubble, and particularly the conversations we're having here today.